On Sunday, June 28th, Vladimir Putin sat down for a state television interview and said something he has never said before in 4 years of this war. He admitted that Russia has a fuel problem. Not a small one, not a rumor. Putin himself, on camera, said there are still lines at gas stations, that drivers and businesses are dealing with real problems, and that finding the right grade of fuel isn't always easy. He called it temporary. He called it not critical. But here is what I want you to sit with for a second. This is the first time in this entire war that Putin has personally detailed how much damage Ukraine's long-range strikes have done to Russia's ability to produce its own fuel. Not a general, not a spokesperson, Putin. And I think this moment matters more than any territory map you'll see this week, because maps show you where the front line moved a few kilometers. This shows you what's actually breaking underneath the war. Let's start with what's actually happening on the ground, because the numbers here are staggering. Since March, Ukraine has carried out more than 50 reported drone strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, fuel depots, oil terminals. Analysts estimate that around a third of Russia's entire refining capacity is currently offline. Russia is the third largest oil producer on the planet. It pumps about 9 million barrels of crude every day. But in June, its refineries only processed around 3.95 million barrels a day. That's roughly a quarter less than the same month last year, and it's the lowest refining output Russia has recorded in more than 2 decades. Gasoline production has fallen even harder, from over 1 million barrels a day down to around 850,000. Industry estimates suggest Russia is now producing about 85,000 metric tons of gasoline daily, while peak summer demand is closer to 110,000 tons. That's a daily shortfall of roughly 25,000 tons every single day, with no clear end date. One of the most damaging strikes hit Moscow's Kapotnya refinery not once, but twice in June, and this is the plant that supplies fuel to the Russian capital itself. This isn't some remote facility in a border region anymore. This is infrastructure feeding Moscow. The result is now visible in ordinary life across Russia, not just in classified briefings or think tank reports. More than half of Russia's 83 regions have introduced fuel rationing or purchase limits. In the Siberian city of Irkutsk, officials installed portable toilets near gas stations because people are waiting in line for hours. Videos have circulated showing arguments and physical fights breaking out at filling stations. In one, 2 women argue over their place in line before it escalates into shouting. In another, in the city of Ryazan, a fight breaks out entirely over who gets fuel next. Police have been called to gas stations in multiple regions. Moscow's response so far has been to lean on its neighbors. Russia has started importing gasoline from Kazakhstan and Belarus, restricted its own gasoline and aviation fuel exports, and is now actively considering a full ban on diesel exports, a product Russia has historically sold abroad in huge volumes. Putin has ordered a task force to work around the clock on fuel supply, prioritizing farms first because Russia's harvest season is approaching, and diesel shortages could hit agricultural output directly. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Putin didn't just admit the problem, he tried to frame it in a very specific way. And that framing tells you something. He said Russia is dealing with the strikes on what he called critical infrastructure, and that these attacks are creating problems, but that none of it is critical, and that repairs are happening quickly. Researchers at the Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank that has tracked this war since day one, reviewed those comments and made an important observation. They noted that Putin avoided directly naming Ukraine's strike campaign, or acknowledging the scale of the shortages nationwide. Instead, he tried to project what the analysts described as an image of calm control, even while the fuel lines were playing out on video for the entire country to see. That's actually a pattern researchers say Putin has used before during past crises. He appears in public taking ownership of a problem, just enough to look aware and in charge, while pushing blame for the failures downward onto regional officials and refinery managers. It lets him look like the person solving the crisis, rather than the person whose war caused it. But there's a reason he couldn't just deny it this time, and that reason is simple. The cues were already impossible to hide. A Finnish researcher who studies Russian politics put it well. A full denial would have looked implausible, and would have cost the Kremlin more credibility than the admission itself. In other words, Putin didn't choose to be honest. He was forced into partial honesty because the alternative, pretending nothing was happening while half the country watched people fight over gas pumps on their phones, would have been worse for him. So why does this matter more than a battlefield map? Because wars aren't just won or lost at the front line. They're won or lost on whether a government can keep its own population functioning while it fights. And what we're watching right now is a very specific kind of pressure test. Russia's central bank has already started adjusting its outlook because of this. A deputy governor at the bank told reporters this week that a fuel sector operating below capacity for several months will likely eat into this year's GDP numbers. The bank has forecast growth of somewhere between just 0.5% and 1.5% for the whole year, an extremely weak number for an economy this size. Inflation has already climbed to around 6%, well above the central bank's 4% target, and rising gasoline prices are a big part of why. According to Gallup polling released in late June, 60% of Russians now say economic conditions in the country are getting worse, the highest number recorded in 2 decades of that same survey. More than half say their living standard is declining. That's the deeper story here. This isn't only about whether a truck driver in Ryazan can find diesel this week. It's about whether ordinary Russians are starting to feel, in a very direct and personal way, that the state can't fully deliver what it has always promised in exchange for their loyalty during wartime. Researchers who study authoritarian systems describe this as a kind of implicit bargain. Citizens accept higher taxes, tighter restrictions, and the demands of a long war, in exchange for the government maintaining basic order and provision. When refineries are on fire and people are lining up for hours just to fill a tank, that bargain becomes visibly strained. Now, why is Ukraine doing this specifically, rather than just focusing purely on the front line? Ukraine's president signed off on what he described as a 40-day operation aimed at pressuring the Kremlin toward ending the war, an operation carried out by the country's security services and announced without many further details. The logic behind targeting refineries and fuel depots instead of purely military targets is straightforward. Fuel isn't just what fills a civilian's car. It's what moves Russian tanks, resupplies frontline units, and keeps the entire war machine running. By hitting the fuel supply at its source, Ukraine is trying to create friction Russia can't easily route around. Friction that shows up in Moscow's own capital, not just near the front. One analyst raised an interesting question worth thinking about. Ukraine has largely avoided striking Russia's pipeline network directly, even though those pipelines stretch for thousands of kilometers and would be almost impossible to fully defend. One theory is that pipelines are relatively cheap and quick to repair compared to refineries, so hitting them wouldn't cause lasting damage. Another theory is that Ukraine may simply be saving that option for a later, more decisive stage of this pressure campaign. If that's true, what we're seeing right now with the refinery strikes might not even be the most severe phase of this economic pressure. It might just be the opening one. All of that raises a real question worth asking honestly, and it's fair to steelman the other side here too. Russia has weathered plenty of predictions of imminent economic collapse before, going back to the very first rounds of Western sanctions in 2022, and the Russian economy, while strained, kept functioning. Analysts covering this current fuel crisis are careful to note that while the shortage is real and visible, the war in Ukraine will almost certainly remain the Kremlin's top priority, regardless of domestic gas lines. And Putin has shown a consistent willingness to absorb civilian hardship rather than change course militarily. Russia has also already found workarounds, importing fuel from Kazakhstan and Belarus, even if those supplies haven't been enough to fully close the gap. So it's entirely possible this crisis eases over the coming weeks as repairs continue and imports increase, exactly as Putin claimed it would. But here's what that argument has to explain away. Repairing refinery capacity damaged by repeated strikes isn't like flipping a switch back on. Many of these facilities need specialized equipment that has become harder to source under years of international sanctions, which is exactly why analysts expect the repairs to take months rather than weeks. And the strikes aren't stopping. Ukraine has continued hitting facilities deep inside Russian territory, including one refinery around 700 kilometers from the border, a distance that shows how far this capability now reaches. If the attacks continue at this pace through the summer, when fuel demand is naturally at its highest because of harvest season and travel, the shortage Putin called temporary could stretch on a lot longer than his own timeline suggested. So here's what to actually watch in the coming weeks, because this story is far from finished. Watch whether Russia follows through on a full diesel export ban. That would be one of the clearest signs yet that the shortage is worse than the Kremlin's public language admits, because Russia has historically relied on diesel exports as a major source of revenue, and giving that up entirely is not a move any government makes over something genuinely minor. Watch the regional numbers too. Right now, more than half of Russia's regions have some form of rationing in place. If that number keeps climbing rather than stabilizing, it tells you repairs aren't keeping pace with the strikes. And watch whether Ukraine expands its strike campaign to the pipeline network that analysts say has so far been largely left alone. If that changes, it would suggest this pressure campaign is moving into a new and more aggressive phase, rather than winding down. Because at the end of the day, a map showing which village changed hands this week tells you very little about who's actually under strain in this war. A president going on state television to admit, in his own words, that his own citizens are stuck in gas lines because of strikes on his own country's infrastructure tells you a great deal more. Putin can call it temporary, he can call it not critical, but the fact that he had to say anything about it at all, after 4 years of controlling nearly every word that reaches Russian television, is the real headline here. Not the battlefield, the gas station line down the street from the Kremlin.